Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from, of course, Command Central at the Philanthropy Mastermind series, where we talk about all things fundraising and philanthropy. And we've been doing this since 2016, thanks to the generosity of our friends at DonorSearch. We don't talk much about DonorSearch here. So if you want to learn more about them, and I hope you do, if you care about your donors, you can do that all at donorsearch.net, where there's also a repository of recordings from this series. But stick around today, because if you're here with us live, you'll want to be a part of this discussion, since it's one we don't have nearly enough. We're having it with somebody who knows this subject better than most people do, because so few people have devoted a big part of their careers to 70% of the philanthropic marketplace, or as I like to think about it, humanity. And that is definitely Erin Nelson. So Erin, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for asking me. I'm very excited.
Very excited to have you. And I want to give people a little kind of thumbnail sketch about some of the things you've done, and then you can tell us more. And then we can dive into a discussion about where you've been and what you've been doing, because it's pretty exciting stuff, even including the background behind you, but we won't go there yet. So if you don't know Erin's work, first of all, she is the Senior Director of International Advancement at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And prior to that, she has a long career in working fundraising and specifically international. And that includes her days back as a Japan exchange and teaching person in Japan, where I'm sure she polished her Japanese skills that she's been able to apply throughout her career. First working within the federal government, and later at Earlham College, Bates College, Maine Medical Center, and then as Director of Development at Thornton Academy, Director of Advancement at the American School in Japan, another great experience before, of course, her work there at Urbana-Champaign, where she's not just sitting in the office in Illinois, but she's been taking her work around the world, dealing with alumni and other donors who care about the work that they do there, and of course, have a heart for philanthropy, as people do all around the world. So with that, Erin, what is the picture behind you?
This is actually, you might think it's Japan, but it's actually the Japan House at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We actually have a world-class complex of tea ceremony rooms, and we're actually going to be expanding this. We're fundraising for that, actually. And so we have some really generous donations already from the former director who started this all at the university. So it's a gem. I was just there a few weeks ago for tea ceremonies to celebrate 20 years of the Tea Association there. And gosh, you got me on my favorite topic in the whole world, so I'm going to stop talking because I could take up the whole hour on tea ceremony.
Okay, well, you have to at least take up 30 seconds on it. So you're obviously a tea ceremony aficionado. You participate in Urasenke, right?
I do, yes, Jay. So impressive. Yes, I have been studying Urasenke tea since I was a study abroad student in Japan, like eons ago. I will reveal my age if I tell you how long ago, but for a very long time. And I actually have my Zoom lesson tonight. I study via Zoom with a teacher who went to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, based in Chicago. And I also am a certified teacher, but in many cultures and in many traditions, you're always a student, and that's certainly the way with the tea ceremony.
Yes, and it goes way back. And I will tie this to philanthropy and fundraising, I promise, but it goes way back. So the tea ceremony is very important in Japan, as are many ceremonies in many countries. And if we kind of ignore that fact, not only do we maybe not fully appreciate where we are and who we're talking to, but we may not realize how much depth there is. So can you just give us a window on the tea ceremony itself? It's not this weird abstract thing. It's meaningful, and there's a lot of history there.
Yes, there's definitely, goes back 500 years and evolved out of rituals for eating and drinking in Buddhist monasteries. And that, tea itself came over from China. And so there's a lot of ties to Chinese culture as well. I think for people today, the real application in daily lives is around mindfulness, because to me, that's really what it's about. It's being present in the moment, removing distractions, leaving your cell phone outside the room, turning it off, unplugging, and being with people and caring about them. And so I think for all of us, it can have value. And certainly at the university, we see that, where there's just so many community people wanting to participate in the activities at Japan House, because it offers something to them, even if they're not, someone who's lived in Japan.
Right. And I guess it goes also to this point that maybe we'll be making throughout, or you may allude to, which is that there's sometimes the specificity also brings us to something that's universal. So when you just talked about mindfulness, it's not like you have to go to Japan and watch them make, green tea in the traditional way in order to understand its significance or maybe appreciate what's underneath it. So is there a story behind the person who gave the tea house?
So actually, Urta Senke donated one of the rooms in the tea house. And so the headquarters of the tea tradition that I happen to follow and that is currently practiced at Urbana-Champaign helped to support this, as did many alumni and donors in our Japan Alumni Club. We have a really strong alumni club in Japan and many countries outside the US. And so this was donor supported and wouldn't have happened without the support of donors, as is the annex. The original director, and his family have made significant gifts to help make that possible. So it's a great story of philanthropy.
Okay, so, and maybe that's another theme we can explore, which is that something that relates to a place that seems far away actually might have people who appreciate it really close to home, or people who've been at the university before, and so they walk the campus and they have a heart for it, even if it seems like it's, again, very, very far away.
Absolutely. I think in the Urbana-Champaign community, for people who've been there or haven't been there, it's kind of an isolated part of Illinois, central part of the state. But it's amazing to see how the community, not just our campus community, but the broader community appreciates the space and the gardens and all that it has to offer. I was able to be there a few weeks ago watching people walk past the windows in the garden and just seeing the diversity of people who are coming to appreciate that space and the peace that it provides was really impressive to me.
Is there a history of this kind of international dimension of the university that you can talk about?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. University of Illinois is long welcomed international students to its campus, and this dates back to the early 1900s and even soon earlier than that. But in the early 1900s, there was a push to welcome students from China. And so we've had students from Korea. We celebrated 100 years of students from Korea last year.
Oh, wow.
Which was a really meaningful occasion for us, and from Japan also for longer than that. And so it's just part of who we are. And again, being in the middle of the US in the Midwest, you would never necessarily expect to have such an international community, but we have over 20% of our students are international. And this is part of such a long history and tradition. So it's just who we are. And I think it's incredibly special.
Can you help us understand those numbers? Because I was just looking at a number today when I was talking about this conversation on LinkedIn, and I realized there are about 750,000 current international students in the United States. So I think we saw a dip during the worst part of the pandemic, but we're starting to see an increase again. But this goes back over 100 years for the university. When you say 20% of the student body, how many is that? And do you have an idea about what the alumni numbers are?
Yes, that's a great question, Jay. So overall in the fall, our international enrollment was 11,548.
Oh, wow.
And we have about 57,000 students. So it's a pretty impressive number. And in terms of alumni population, we believe about 50,000 of our alumni live overseas. And with the growth, I would say, of our online programs, we have an online MBA, which is global in scope. We have about 4,000 people, I think, enrolled in that, many of whom are outside the US. I think we're going to continue to see those numbers of alumni rise. And I'm always deeply impressed by the philanthropic interest of online alumni. I think there may be an assumption that they might not have the same kind of affinity, not having spent as much time on campus. But I've been really interested to see how many donors we have internationally who are graduates of online programs.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because this idea of wearing the brand is something I've heard for a long time. And if a person gets a degree or attends a program or even spends a semester or goes for an education program for a month, or their sister went there or their kid went there, this is all meaningful to many families. So there are a couple dimensions. One is if you could explore a bit about how an online program also has that affinity, that would be great. And then maybe talk about the ways that you maintain those relationships, because that seems to have been one of the difficulties for many places, is to say, well, we don't have the numbers, you do have the numbers, or we don't know where they are. So how have you, first of all, if you could address that idea about that affinity, and then how you maintain it?
Those are great questions. I think the affinity, just, some examples of alumni who I've met, some of our alumni do come to campus for commencement and for other student activities while they're students. Our MBA program has a large campus component that happens, once a year. And so some students will come back for that. But I think that affinity is built with the impact this degree had on their lives in many
Mhm.
cases. And so, if this online degree gave you the ability to upskill in a way and have those, the acronym after your name that you really need to advance in the business world, then that builds, a strong affinity for you.
Mhm.
Also, I believe a lot of our alumni in these online programs develop their own local cohort. And so and this is kind of staying in touch as well. This is a component of that, is that they build their local cohort and then they're staying in touch with each other. And so I just need to find one of those folks who's part of that little cohort. And then I have, the ability to connect with all of them. And so I've seen that in both India and also in Japan, with alumni who are, have that kind of cohort that they stay in touch with.
And I'm sure that's one way that you can find where they are now, because otherwise getting an address for somebody in another country sometimes can be a little bit challenging.
Yes, and I'm finding that social media for international alumni is really critical, because your social media presence, your WhatsApp, your phone number, is not changing so much, but your email is changing frequently, because your
Mhm.
email gets overwhelmed by spam. We're like, oh, I'll just make a new email.
Right.
So we are finding that being in touch through social media and just like, here's my QR code, connect with me on WhatsApp, is really critical for staying in touch with folks internationally.
And by the way, we do have an open channel here. If you're live with us and you have a question, feel free to post it, and we'll make sure that our producer will be able to help us look through those. Otherwise, just continue to enjoy. But the reason I mention that right now is it's quite possible that some people who are with us live have no idea what WhatsApp is, even though it's so dominant in some of these other countries you're talking about. I mean, for example, I've had communications with people in India where that's the only way I'm going to talk to that particular person. And I'm not generalized about India. I'm just saying that this happens from place to place. So what are besides something like WhatsApp, what are the primary means of communication that you found to be particularly helpful as you explore
That's a
relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you kind of have to communicate to people on the platform of choice for them.
Mhm.
And so, in addition to WhatsApp for certain countries, Japan has Line, Korea has Kakao,
Mhm.
LinkedIn in terms of prospecting, finding new, prospects, and also staying in touch with people, getting in touch with people if we don't have their social media
Mhm.
coordinates, or we don't have an email. LinkedIn Sales Navigator is something really important. And then I have worked with crypto donors, and so they use Telegram a lot of the time. And so, you have to make a Telegram account. And so I have a lot of different accounts.
Yeah.
And that's how, yeah, it's really critical for international fundraising, I would say.
That must be a lot for you to juggle. What kind of team do you have there managing all this stuff? You've got tens of thousands of, alumni. How do you do it?
Well, we have a pretty small team. There's two frontline fundraisers. My boss also does some frontline work in Singapore, where she used to live.
Oh.
And so she and I actually worked in similar roles at similar type schools, one in Singapore, one in Japan, at the same time before we came to U of I. So that's another one of those small world stories. But then we also have an international constituent engagement associate director who helps to stay in touch with our alumni clubs all over the world and help to arrange engagement opportunities that help us to drive and encourage philanthropy.
And then there must be a research component as well. So first of all, that's a subset of the entire development operation there. So how large is the fundraising apparatus of the advancement office, and what part does research play, especially in the international front?
That's a great question. I would say we have a couple hundred people at U of I probably working in advancement. We also have the University of Illinois Foundation, which does a lot of the back end work, which includes research. And so we do have a researcher who focuses on regional and global advancement research. And so, you have to have a close partnership with that person, and we have to have a lot of creative strategies for finding and keeping in touch with our alumni. And so, yeah, it's really important to partner with your campus support network when you are a small team and you're trying to work with 50,000 alumni.
Right. But you're talking about a good sized university with a lot of people to serve. And even there, you've got a fairly tight group of people to do that work, and even smaller subset that's supportive of it, like with the research piece. Part of the reason I asked you about that is because there's a tendency for us in this field to say, well, yeah, sure, they do it there because they have all these people and all this money, and they have language skills and all this experience before they got there, but I can't do it at my little place. You've been in several places, as I said when I introduced you. And if we were going to go back to, and maybe it's good to jump to a place like Thornton Academy, because the international school is a slightly different environment, which will be fun to talk about. But at Thornton Academy, first of all, for those who don't know it, where is it, and how did international play a role in your work there?
That's a wonderful question, Jay. So Thornton Academy is in southern Maine, in Saco, Maine, lovely town on the coast of Maine. And it is a very interesting school in that it's a town academy. So it serves the local, basically tax-paying population, but it is a private institution. And they were actually very forward-looking and decided to build dorms some years ago to welcome international students, which, I mean, the reality is that international students typically pay full tuition. And so that is an income generator for many institutions. And so, but what it added was this incredible international component to a school in small town Maine, grades 6 through 12. And the bulk of the international student population was from China, but there were students from Europe and South America as well. And so international fundraising remarkably was part of the picture there, particularly from parents, because the alumni were still quite young and not in a position to donate yet. So we worked to cultivate our international parents and build relationships with them. And so it was a really unique environment that probably many private schools in the US will share. Actually, it's
Yeah,
unique, but maybe not so unique
I
actually.
was going to say that. So for the and even though Thornton is all schools are unique, but Thornton's additionally unique for the reasons you just mentioned. But what percentage of the population was international students?
It was maybe they probably had 100 or so international students, and I'm trying to remember how many. It was 1,500 students total
Right.
maybe.
And so it's significant even at that scale. But you, as an institution, you were dedicated to serving them as well as the rest, and also saw an opportunity with them that you did with the rest. There's another kind of assumption that people make, which is, I think, should be beaten up a little bit, and that is that with younger folks, that they don't have the same level of commitment, that they're going to move out, go to their college, and then that's where they're going to put their energies. And that is especially true of their parents. Did you find that to be the case, or were you able to build relationships with that younger group of alumni and their parents, and then sustain that at a place like Thornton?
You mean with the domestic or specifically with the international population?
With the international, I mean, all of it's interesting, and you can talk about all of it. But yes, particularly people far away.
Yes, I think that was I think the staying in touch with the alumni, like we were talking about earlier, is a challenge. And I think at that point in time, we were a small team trying to do a lot, domestic and international. It certainly makes it harder to stay in touch when you're focusing on so many different balls. I think even though in my current role, we have a smallish team for the number of alumni that we have. At least we are able to focus very specifically on the international. I think it does become more difficult when you're focused on both domestic and international. And so sustaining the relationships becomes a bit more difficult.
Yeah. But I guess there's still something to work with, but it just makes the work tougher, especially with a small team. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So now one other aspect of this is you've focused a lot in your career and I guess your passions with Japanese. Now, Japan may be the world's, is it the fourth largest economy now? I'm trying to remember if it's the third or the fourth. I don't know. Do you?
I'm guessing not third, or probably about to drop from that. But I'm not sure, Jay.
Sure. But I'm saying that because for context, you still got a lot of people there. I can't remember the latest population figures, but you're talking over 120 million. And not everybody in the world speaks Japanese. So one of the things that people might think is, well, if you focus on a population that's of that scale, are you going to find there's revenue? I mean, that's a small way of thinking about something because you've got a lot of people with a lot of history, with a lot of generosity, but just thinking in terms of market share. You made a commitment to this and you've continued to be able to draw on that throughout your career, but I suspect it's not Japanese only. Like, for example, you went on a recent trip and where did you go? And what kinds of students and alumni do you work with all the time?
Yeah, so because I think a lot of institutions are like this, like we do go where our population is, our alumni population, where we have critical mass.
Right.
So historically, Japan has been a strong, had sent many students during certain, decades overseas. That has certainly declined. So I try to keep ahead of trends and be aware of what population trends are and ensure that we are pivoting and adjusting our strategy accordingly. And so, we travel to China. My recent trip was to Hong Kong. Didn't make it to China because the visas were not restarted until I was already on my trip. But Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, Japan, and Korea. And now coming up, I'll be going to India and UK. As well on my next trip. And so, India is a growing population, certainly from a student perspective, and also, just in terms of raw numbers of population there and a rising economy. And so we do, follow those historic trends and where we have alumni who may be in a position to support the university very generously, but also, there's a lot of wealth being generated in countries that weren't generating it before. And also there are a lot of young alums who have significant wealth in the startup sphere. And so things are constantly changing. And in this line of work, it's important to keep an eye on the trends and make sure that your strategy is adjusted accordingly.
How are you determining which markets to focus on? I mean, even for your travel, is it largely just a matter of there are X number of students there, or excuse me, alumni there and Y number there, or are there other factors that you're discussing with other faculty members or administration colleagues?
Well, we are Illinois, our office called Illinois International, which is we don't work under that office, but we work closely with them. They did a strategic plan recently. And so, I watched their presentation. I've read the documents and know that looking ahead, the Global South is going to be more of a focus. And so that's where population growth is. And so but for immediate purposes, we do go where we have the greatest number of prospects and the greatest ability, we think, to secure philanthropic resources for the university and for the mission. And so that can be driven not just by sheer numbers, but also where, there is someone who has that interest and ability. And then, we will go there to further that relationship.
And that's being identified both by the research team, but also by probably just the work that you're doing, right? Talking to other alumni and things like that. A person who owns a company, a person who's made a gift somewhere. I mean, what are the signs that you look for when you're thinking about these things?
It's a lot of, I would say, if you've lived overseas, you develop some instincts of, who might be able to have an impact and interest in doing so. And so I do a lot of work on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I have searches that I run in certain geographic areas. Just as an example, I was looking at a list of alumni with Asian studies degrees, and, just Googling the name and, oh, he's an ambassador. Wow, didn't know that. And so it is a lot of creative approaches to finding people.
One thing that has really struck me over the years is that in many places, or even across the whole country, that we've seen ebbs and flows of interest in having relationships with people outside our borders. And it's not always political. I mean, sometimes there may be a dimension, but sometimes it's economic. We think we don't have the resources to do that, or it's interest. A place says we're more international, or they say, no, we're more focused on the local. There are lots of different factors. If at the university, if you have this history going back to the early part of the last century, have you still seen those ebbs and flows? And what do you and colleagues do to make sure that the interest level is maintained so you can continue to go out and do the work?
I think that, yeah, because of this long commitment and relationship internationally and global engagement that U of I has, it has been a consistent investment from the university in maintaining these relationships. And I think for our part, developing really good campus partnerships is critical, because, it's easy to be in your little silo, but we work for the entire university. Our team is somewhat unique. Regional and global gets to work with every single college and every single nook and cranny in the university to help secure philanthropic resources for them. And so keeping those relationships strong, and have seen my LinkedIn. I like to promote what our alumni are doing and the awesome things they're achieving. And so I think that plays a role too, is just like promoting the contributions of our international alumni. And I think at U of I, it will never change because of that long history, and it's just who we are. So I feel very fortunate to work at an institution like that.
Yeah, that has that kind of international commitment. It's funny though, because I've seen, especially in higher ed, a friend told me about how a wrestling program, for example, that had been there for many decades, at one point there seemed to be a loss of interest in that program, and so there was a lot of fighting internally to make sure that you were still in it, that wrestling still had support and that would continue as a program. And when I was at the University of Michigan as a student, there was this whole discussion about the geology building or something, and same kind of thing. But I guess history matters where you are. And that's important also, probably not just to maintaining the program so you can go out and do the good work, but it must say something to the alumni.
Absolutely. They appreciate us showing up. I think showing up has a lot of value internationally. And for years, we are a thin team. We do have to pick and choose where we can go, and we have a budget. But we've started recently traveling to India, as we've seen the population of alumni grow there, and they appreciate that so much. And so just being there, I think, means a lot to our alumni.
Why? Why is that so important to them that you show up?
I'll tell you a funny story. So it's the power of a t-shirt, Jay.
Okay.
I think part of showing up, this is it's just a funny example, but bringing a t-shirt means so much to our alumni. This conversation comes up everywhere I go. It's like, how can I get swag? How can I order swag from this country? And so, I had some t-shirts at a little event in India. It's the first time, and someone from our office had been there in many years, and maybe ever, and did a little raffle or whatever. And one guy got a t-shirt, and then he messages me, and he's someone who could probably easily find a way to get a t-shirt, probably. And he's like, oh my gosh, I somebody took my t-shirt. He's like, I left it on a chair at the bar and somebody took it, and he was distraught. And so this kind of story comes up again and again, people just want a t-shirt. And so, I mean, funny, but just having access to a t-shirt that represents part of who they are, their alma mater, it's their family. And I think with family too, showing up is really important. And so, even for life milestones, things like that, sending cards, showing that you've took the time to come and celebrate with them, celebrate who they are as a community and Illini community. It means so much to people.
Giving them the t-shirt must be meaningful too, because as you say, they can buy one online, but it's not the same.
It's not the same.
It's not the same. I love that story, and you probably have stories for every place where you've been working. Can you give us another kind of taste of something that's been particularly meaningful when you go out and you visit with people besides t-shirts? There are probably a whole bunch of things, but maybe something that really surprised you.
Oh gosh, something that surprised me. Um, it's hmm. I think there was a meeting I had recently. People ask, what's one of the most interesting people you met? I get to meet just the most incredible people.
Mhm.
Um, I There was a gentleman I met in Japan recently, and he, um, you know, older alum, I will say, who took me to lunch, and he was telling me that his sister went to the US in the 50s to study. And I was just like mind blown. Jay, you have a lot of experience in Japan. I'm like, in the 50s? Like parents let your sister go to the US? I was just like, I have found that fascinating. Then he said, well,
Mhm.
then my parents had to let me go. And so he came to University of Illinois. But then what he told me is that when he left, he traveled around the world and he wrote a book about it,
Oh, wow.
like actually multiple volumes. And I said, I want your book. Like I
Oh,
want to put it
wow.
on our alumni shelf. And he shared with me some, snippets from it. He had printed out, brought with him some snippets. And I was just like, they're just like one-liners about people he encountered in his travels. But I was just so deeply impressed by this gentleman that he did that in that time when I'm sure it was not easy to travel around the world. He didn't go to easy places either. And so that was pretty awesome to meet him and hear his stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there some things that you've seen changing over these years? That something that maybe you experienced when you were doing some of these travels, maybe even early on in your life, and then today, and where you see a difference, maybe in the way that they're receiving us as Americans going and visiting these places?
It's interesting. I feel like the change has been in me in some ways.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Well, because I have a long history of engaging with Japan in particular, I think when you're starting out going there, you do everything, you're going to do everything exactly by the book in terms of cultural awareness. And then as you get, maybe it's age related too, that you're just like, well, I am American. I'm still very obviously, I think to anyone looking at me, they'd be like, you're very culturally appropriate, like you're behaving very appropriately. But I think I've relaxed a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, and and so I think that travel and engaging with the world, it changes you probably more than it changes. And so I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, when you go to some place for the first time, Japan's a great example of this, where how low to bow or how to hold a business card or all these things that we're all taught that I'm sure you still observe things in a way
Yes,
that's respectful, but then the expectations of you may be different. And as a result, you can be more yourself than maybe when you're there as you're in the first stiff visit. Um,
yes.
and then that's true around the world. You haven't seen people saying, well, you Americans or whatever, or that they're open to visits from you and your colleagues.
Absolutely. And one story I will say that, recent experience that surprised me is had met with alumnus the second time I'd met this individual. And always he's been kind to make sure I get on my way and go in the right direction and, get on the train going the right way or whatever. And this is in Korea where I don't yet, but I'm studying, speak and read the language. And so he, as we were parting most recently, I was like, okay, I'm gonna, shake his hand. And then he like went for a hug, and it deeply touched me
Wow.
because I realized it's because it's a family. It's the Illini family. It's his alma mater. Like I am part of that family. I am the representative for the university of his family, of his, he he called it his base camp because he's a mountain guy, and so
Oh,
he
yeah.
climbs mountains. And so I was just like so touched and honored, because I realized I'm the representative of part of his family. And it was, yeah, very touching.
It also sounds like you gave him space to make that decision for himself rather than kind of being the American going in for the hug. You let him decide when it was right for him to welcome you to the family. That's very special. So those are some of the things that you've seen. It sounds like not a lot of change, which is a good thing, except maybe changing yourself. If somebody though is thinking about doing something like the work that you've been doing, are there some lessons that you've taken from it along the path that you think would be helpful to almost anybody who decided we really need to engage with the world, that there's something beyond our borders? What are some of the chief lessons that they should have and they can bring to their institutions, whether they're small or big?
That's a good question. I think it's more tips maybe of what you should be aware of if you're going to dive into this. And these are lessons that I've learned too, of course, but resilience is critical, because it's a hard and long road. So resilience and patience, you have to be committed, to be in this for the long haul.
Mm.
It's not like you show up on someone's doorstep and, most cases they're not ready for the conversation. And so it's takes longer than in the US. And I certainly went to India thinking, oh, this is great, we're gonna raise a lot of money, right out of the gate. And now I'm like, okay, it takes years probably to build this relationship. So I would say, that's a lesson I've learned, is that it may take longer than you initially anticipate. And I would say that you have to be able to navigate jet lag. That's just a practical thing. Um, Figuring
You can write
out
a whole book about that. So if you know what to do to navigate jet lag, you should tell us right now, because I have no idea. Is this melatonin? What is this? What
sunlight
sunlight?
and exercise
Mhm.
outside if it's sunny, is really important. Um, yes, those are some of the key things I think. And yeah, passion for the mission and just being committed to sharing that passion,
Right.
um, with your constituents.
So one of the fears again that people have in embarking on a program like this, even if they've made a good case for it, that the numbers are there, um, is that, well, I can't speak the language. I don't know how to do this. Can you talk about that? Because you have this language skill set. So someone watching this might think, well, of course you could do this. What about for others?
Absolutely, because I speak Japanese and a little bit of Hebrew, and that's it. So I go to plenty of countries where I don't speak the language. Yes, I can read the characters, which is helpful in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, but I don't speak the language, and so I don't speak any of the languages except for English spoken in India, and so and in Thailand. So I just recently went to Thailand, hadn't been there in many years, and had a whole conversation with my taxi driver that neither of us understood, but it was fantastic. And so it was a precious, precious taxi ride that I thoroughly enjoyed, even though neither of us knew what we were saying to the other person. So I would say don't be afraid. Just, yeah, be respectful, learn the basics of what's culturally appropriate. Attire, I think, is a big thing to be aware of, is to be appropriately attired and covered, depending on the culture. So um, don't be afraid. Just do it.
Yeah, and actually some of those things are things that we used to have to read about in a book if we could find it, and now that's widely available, right? I mean, there's also more opportunities for people who are engaged in this work, big places, small places, higher ed, non-higher ed, to talk with one another. So how are you engaging with colleagues at this point in your career and sharing ideas and stories?
Thanks for asking that question. We actually have amongst universities a WhatsApp group for international fundraisers. And so I posted a question there earlier, and my colleague posted a question there yesterday. And so that has been an incredibly invaluable tool. And then also then following up with people that you find on LinkedIn or who you've met through conferences or things. I'm meeting someone locally where I live who doesn't do international but does fundraising, and those are important connections as well. And so just building your network, and you have to just put some effort into that to reach out to people because they're not going to reach out to you necessarily. So
Right. And speaking of which, so if somebody wants to make contact with you, is that something you're open to? And how can they best follow you and be in contact with you and talk about these things with you?
I would welcome anyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to find me. And Jay, you found me that way too, in terms of inviting me, which I really appreciate that you did that, and that to learn that we had so many, commonalities in our lives as well.
It's yes, a lot of water under the bridge, as they said in Casablanca, another international city, at least in the movies. So Erin, this has been really a lot of fun to talk with you about this, and you've provided such specific and wonderful actionable things that people can think about, broad and narrow things that people can do to build a program. Thank you so much for
Thank
that.
you, Jay.
And I is there a, last question. So I know this is the hardest question to ask. So what is your favorite tea?
My favorite tea?
Yes.
Well, it's either Gyokudo green tea, that's what I'm drinking today. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Or it's Earl Grey from Fortnum and Mason's. My husband's
We get a
British,
shipment
so
every month. Oh, yes.
do you from Fortnum and Mason's?
Yes, it's either Fortnum and Mason, or we'll get stuff from Harney and Sons. So no, they're not
Oh,
sponsoring this
wow.
series. But yeah, Harney is, we
Wow.
learned our cupping at Harney and Sons. Wow, thank you. And
Thank you, Jay.
this has been a blast. Thank you to those hanging out with us live, and to those who are watching this afterwards. I hope you'll follow Erin's work, and I hope this inspires you to think beyond your borders. And so with that, please do hang out for the rest of the sessions in the series. We're doing 120 this year, and you can see all of those or listen to them, depending upon what they are, over on the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net under the resources tab. And you'll see links to that coming up right now as we show you some slides, including a little QR code. So if you want to know about your donors, and you should, you can learn all about them through our friends at DonorSearch. So with that, we'll see you next time. And again, thanks, Erin.